When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 16. Jen ran along the corridor. How long was this thing? She wondered why she never knew that this was there. It seemed to run the entire length of the gymnasium and then around it. It was surprisingly well lit, and the walls were clean. Who the heck went back here and cleaned all of this? There was no door outside, however. That was a bit odd given the emergency exit nature of the door. Of course, it was probably created more as a kind of safe room in case there was a prisoner riot than a place to hide during a fire. But still, there had to be an exit somewhere. Her arms and legs hurt. Her entire body felt bruised. She was completely exhausted in ways she had never thought possible. She heard the creatures on the other side of the wall still snarling and growling. She also heard explosions, which sounded like they might have come from the outside of the building. For all she knew, everyone inside the building was dead, and Hive City was under attack now. She picked up the pace a bit. Jen broke into a light jog. Up in the distance, there was a red glow cast on one of the walls. Even from the distance she could tell it was an exit sign. Her people needed her. She had to get there and get back into this fight. Mike and Dalton approached the gymnasium door. It had been locked, of course, when Jen had pulled the emergency alarm, but just to keep them in there, furniture had been stacked up in front of the doors. Still, the stack of furniture began to shake as the creatures on the other side repeatedly slammed themselves against the doorframe. Even from behind the doors and the blockage, he could hear them snarling and growling, and some of them trying to speak. "Are we really going to go in there?" Mike whispered to Dalton. Dalton cocked his head to the side, studying the scene before him. "I guess we have to." "How do we keep from being overwhelmed?" Mike asked. There were others behind them. More guards, each armed with flamethrowers and the homemade explosive devices. They all shifted from one foot to the other and looked absolutely terrified. It was hard to argue with that feeling. Mike was terrified too. "I wish we could hear from Reg and find out how the flamethrowers and bombs are working out there," Dalton whispered back. Mike hit the walkie on his shoulder. Reg, can you report? What's happening?" There was a long pause, and then the microphone kicked into life. There was noise in the background, shooting, and some consistent roaring sound that Mike could only guess was the flames from the flamethrowers. "We're mowing them down, but when we hit them with the fire, they just keep coming," Reg reported. "Then you have a flaming zombie headed right for you." Mike looked at Dalton. "Well, that doesn't sound promising." Dalton thought for a moment. "Basically, they aren't burning fast enough. We need to get the brain to die faster, in other words." "Well, now is a great time to figure this out, Dalton," Mike commented. "How do we make that happen?" "There's a fuel line beneath this building, correct? You have some kind of fuel that helps heat this building and even gets pumped into Hive City?" Mike had a moment to be baffled by how much this man knew about how things worked around here. "I want to know how you know that, but we don't have time to get into it. Yes, there's oil and gas and things we've tapped into down here. We do have some gasoline-powered things we use in the mining operations, but that's all back down by the mines, and I am not running down there again." Dalton smirked and shook his head. "The oil should suffice. We need to find a way to tap that line and then connect it to the sprinkler system in the gym. There is a sprinkler system in there, correct?" Again, Mike wanted to interrogate this man on where he got his information. One thing at a time. Stop the apocalypse, and then you can question Dalton King. "Yes, there is. This is all great. Do you know how to do that?" Mike asked. "I have some ideas, but there has to be an engineer or a mechanic who can help." "Maybe not one that's either still alive or not turned into one of those things, Dalton." Dalton's smirk grew. "Then time to ask." Before Mike could do anything, Dalton jumped on a desk. "Excuse me, we need someone who can help us here. Is there an engineer or a maintenance person or someone very mechanically inclined who could help us? 4 people stepped forward. Fantastic. Dalton jumped down off the desk. Look, we have a slight problem, but we might have a solution. However, it requires a bit of mechanical know-how, plus we also need this done pretty quickly. Reg and the rest of his team had pushed the creatures back up against the gate. There were several of the creatures running up the walls, on fire, still snarling and growling. They didn't seem to be in any pain at all. They were just snarling instead of screaming. Reg tossed another one of Dalton's bombs, and it exploded a few moments later and blew several of the creatures apart. Flaming debris rained down on all of them. So far, they had not lost any more of the team, but they had heard a scream from the other side of the gate, and Reg worried Carl was either one of them now, or torn to pieces. How much more fuel was in this flamethrower? There was no gauge to tell, but he hoped it would be enough to get the rest of them that had squeezed through the gap in the gate. Please let there be enough, he thought. There has to be enough. Of course, Reg was sure that if he had to use his knife and stab each of these things in the head to kill them, then he was ready to do that. Then they were right at the opening of the gate. Reg pushed through, gasping when his hand brushed the metal. It was so hot. Behind him, the rest of the man came through. While there were still creatures and flames staggering around, they were slowing down. Several of them fell over. Reg pushed through and stepped to the other side. There was the road leading to the gate, and off to the left was the little hut where Carl sat. The man who had said hello to him every morning for the years he had been here. The man everyone knew by name, and who was invited to all of the picnics and family events. There were no creatures right there on the other side. However, there was blood all over the small hut where Carl normally sat. There were metal casings on the ground. The windows were shattered. The man had fought the creatures right up until he couldn't. All of the men stood and stared. There was a hand up against the window. It was also covered in blood. None of them wanted to see how much of Carl was left. Fortunately, the screeching sounds of the creatures snapped them all out of their reveries. Reg looked up and past the hut where Carl's body was now so much meat and bone. He could see the creatures, headed over the fake lawns and crawling across the houses and buildings. They were headed for the school. Somehow they knew they had to head there. Maybe they could smell the people, or maybe someone had been turned that knew where the safe zone was. Either way, they were headed there, running in a shambling way, snarling, drooling. We have work to do yet, guys, Reg said. The school is on lockdown, and they have guns, but they aren't trained for this. We are. No one protested. Reg hit the mic on his shoulder. Dozens of the creatures managed to get through the gate. They got Carl. They're now headed for the school. If you can hear us at the school, we're headed your way, but you better hold things down. Shoot for the head. The men, having been running for more than an hour now, headed off. They were tired, scared, sweating, hungry, but not one of them was ready to lay down and give up. Hive City lay ahead, and they were going to get these things out of their homes. Jen finally reached the exit sign. She turned left and hit the metal bar on the door. It didn't budge. Cursing, she hit the thing again, then again. I am not going to have fought my way down here and end up stuck in a fucking hallway, she said, and this time she kicked the metal bar. The bar gave, and the door creaked open. Jen breathed a sigh of relief. Now she knew where she was. She was in a back office area that had not been used in months. It was dark, but she could make out the cubicles. Just across that room, and off to the left, was the door that would lead to another hallway. That hallway would lead back to the gymnasium, and she could find Mike and find out what was going on. She had heard Reg, of course. She knew that Carl was gone, but she did her best to keep it inside and lock it away for now. From the other side of the wall, she could hear people yelling back and forth. It was too far away, and the wall was too thick to make out what was going on, but everyone was in a tizzy for sure. Hopefully, it was to destroy the things in the gym, but she had to find out. Jen stepped out into the darkness and shadow and began to walk through the office. The door to the hall she had been in shut behind her loudly. It made her jump, and the darkness in here was very disturbing. She was halfway across the office when she heard something within the shadows. It was not footsteps, and it did not sound human. It was sort of like a sigh followed by a scraping. Having been nearly mauled to death in the gym, she knew what it was. Something was in here with her, and it was not human. One of the creatures was in here with her. "Shit," she whispered. Alvin held his breath and held the gun in his hands even tighter. His heart hammered so loud in his chest that he was sure everyone around him could hear it as well. His breath felt shallow and like he was breathing a little too hard. "You have to calm down," he thought. "You are going to hyperventilate, and then you'll be of no use to anyone. They need you to lead." He put the gun down, and then his hands on his knees. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Remembered the training. He had been so prepared to shoot down prisoners if they had rioted and were trying to take over Hive City. Now he had to take down these horrible creatures that either killed or they turned people he knew and loved into creatures like them. After a few moments, he felt in control of himself, and he stood back up and peered out of the thin slit in the metal shutter. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Alvin could see them. How many? 100? Maybe more? Maybe less? They were running over the rooftops and across the lawns. They leapt and scurried, and even from this far away, he could hear them snarling and drooling and growling. There was nothing remotely human about them. They ran on all fours, leaping and running like animals. They made sounds that were not human, and even from where he stood, he could see their hair was falling out. Their flesh was rotting. "How the hell am I in this situation?" he asked himself. He raised the rifle and found one of the leaping creatures and began to track it. The scope brought the vision even closer to him, and he could see the sores and the rotting pieces of flesh falling off the body. Had it been burned, perhaps? Maybe it had been standing next to one of the others that had been burned. The creature peered into windows as it went. They were looking for any residents that might still be in their houses. There was no one. "Get ready and shoot for the head," Alvin called out. "Take your time and remember your training. We need to take them down once they're in range." He looked to his left, and there were 2 women, still in their skirts, with the rifles up to their eyes. Over to his right were 2 high school seniors, barely old enough to vote, and neither of them old enough to buy a drink, also with the scopes up to their eyes. "The barriers will hold. Just shoot straight. Reg and some of the others will be right behind. We've got this." Alvin put the scope back up to his own eye. He wished he felt as certain about things as he tried to appear. "Shoot straight," he told himself, citing the same creature he had been following. "Shoot for the head." Mike and Dalton had little to do while the engineers and mechanics worked on transferring the oil to the sprinkler system. "This is an insane idea," Mike thought to himself. "How are we going to stop the gym or this entire building from burning down once we do this?" he asked Dalton. "I am sorry to say, Michael, that the gym will be out of commission for a while. I apologize if this ruins the interleague basketball tournament or someone's pickleball practice. However, it is my understanding that these doors are fireproof. Isn't that why Jen ran in there and wanted to herd them into the gym? It will burn for a time, and the gym will need repairing. But we can head in there with fire hoses once all of the creatures are dead. Really dead." Mike hoped that Dalton was correct. What was going to happen if they set the gym on fire and then the entire building burned out? How many would die trying to get out? What would they do if the entire system that held the Hive together was destroyed? It was the kind of thing an administrator would think about, and he could not help but chastise himself for thinking this way. Right now, he had to stop these creatures. To snap him out of his thoughts, the engineer came up to him. "We have it hooked up. I think oil is going to leak all over the goddamn place, but if you just coat them enough to burn, we should be okay." "Thanks," Mike said. "Thank you for doing this." The engineer just nodded and walked away. Another person that Mike did not know fully but had seen around the office before. If he got out of this, he really needed to spend some more time with these people. It was too easy to get lost in the administrative duties at the top and forget all of the people who had also chosen to live down here and separate themselves from the sun. "Okay, let's do it," Mike said to Dalton. Dalton also just gave a nod and gathered up his flamethrower and some of the fire bombs he had brought with him. "Turn on the sprinkler system," Mike said into his microphone. A silence fell across the office. There was a loud squeaking sound, and the entire building vibrated. Then that died down, and very distinctly, there was the sound of something spraying within the gym. For a moment, Mike was back on the surface, sitting in his house as a young man listening to the rain. Liquid pattered down on the floor and the equipment in the gym. The creatures reacted violently. Whether or not their collective hive mind realized what was happening, Mike would never know. But they began to throw themselves against the doors and pound even harder. Dents began to appear in the metal. "Okay, turn it off," Dalton called. "No more. We don't want to drown them in oil." There was more squeaking, and then the pipes in the wall shuddered again. The sound of rain stopped inside the gymnasium, but the creatures kept growling and snarling, pounding on the door. In fact, the pounding got more intense. One of the metal doors, already dented, actually shook in its frame. "We better do this. Not sure how long that frame or those hinges are going to hold," Mike said. Dalton fired up his flamethrower. "The moment we open those doors, they're going to try and come falling out. We have to push them back with a wall of flame. Once we light one or two, the rest of them, if they're packed as tight as they seem to like to congregate, then they'll all go up. Prepare yourselves. Once we get them burning, we'll need to lock them back in. Hey, engineer and mechanic, get the water hooked back up. We have to let them burn until they are no longer a threat, but we can't risk a fire in this place." Everyone did as Dalton suggested. Mike had just a moment to marvel at how the man had stepped in and taken over this organization so quickly. No one saw the man who had killed so many. He was the man who was going to save them. "Ready?" Mike cried out. Several people stood near the doors, holding the handles. One of them was near the button that would release the lock. "Now!" Mike cried. The doors opened. Jen froze and waited for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. She could hear the creature moving. The telltale growling, slobbering sounds they made gave it away. It was between here and the door, but she couldn't see where. "Where are you, you son of a bitch?" Jen whispered. A shadow slowly descended from the ceiling. Had it been up above the ceiling? She thought that was the case, but these things could also crawl across the walls and ceiling. She had the distinct feeling that this creature had run away from the rest of the group, showing surprising independence given the hive mind these things had. Her eyes finally adjusted, and she could even see who it was. His name had been Todd when he worked in the offices. He was a nice enough guy, but now, saliva or some other hideous liquid dripped down his chin and onto the floor with an audible plop. His suit was torn and dirty, which seemed to confirm he had been running up above the ceiling tiles. "Todd, are you still in there?" Jen asked as the creature began to move toward her. The thing that had once been Todd walked in a strange, hitchy gait. His arms and legs did not seem to work together in any way. His head twitched back and forth, and when it did so, his neck bones cracked. "Todd, if you're in there, it's me, Jen," she said. "Please, you have to be in there somewhere. Please, just let me pass." Todd just kept coming. When he reached about 10 feet from where Jen stood, he leaped through the air. Jen held up both of her hands and caught him in midair, and they fell backwards onto the floor. Jen got her feet under the creature and sent him sailing over her head, where he landed back near the door she had just come in, on his back. She got to her feet as fast as possible. She had just gotten to her feet when Todd hit her full speed in the side and wrapped his stinking arms around her shoulders. All of the wind rushed out of her lungs, and when she gasped, she could smell and even taste the rotting corpse that held onto her. They were carried forward, and pain exploded all around her eyes and all over her body as they smashed into the cubicle right near them. She was on her back, and everything went black for a moment as she saw stars and bright colors from hitting the cubicle wall so hard. Todd's arms were still around her, and the desk was hard and unyielding beneath them. Jen opened her eyes, and what she saw was a row of teeth. The mouth opened, and as she tried to get her breath back, the open mouth lunged for her. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next week for The Hive, Part 17. Written by Brian W. Alaspa. Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.